Thank you, and like Reg, I'm glad to be here, and given our age, I'm especially glad to be here. I'm reminded, several years ago I got an honorary degree at Concordia in Montreal, and they had something like the Chancellor's Dinner, and we weren't told we were going to have to say something at the dinner. And so the president got up and he said, well, we hadn't planned on this, but we think the honorary degree recipients should say something now, not tomorrow at the convocations, but say something now. And we'll start with, now I'm having a senior's moment. What's his name, McLean? The guy who just died? Stuart McLean. And then we'll have Bryan. I'm speaking after Stuart McLean. This really isn't fair. So I make a similar point here, but I'll do the best I can. Incidentally, it turned out okay with Stuart because I didn't realize he'd been a student at Sir George, which became Concordia, and had done rather poorly, and they tried to throw him out several times. And he was in tears talking about that, and I went, well, I got that beat. I'm not going to be in tears about Concordia. Okay. I want to give you fair warning. I'm really biased. I'm going to focus on the scientists that I feel really made a difference. And then I'm going to look at the improbable rise of my department at the very end. And I'll say a little bit about why in the world I came here in the first place, and you'll be a little surprised as to why that was. But to follow up on Reg, why would you attract people here? There's no labs, no science history, and as you said, no reputation, there's nothing. And I remember once I got here, and I'd been here about 2 years, there was a headline in the Calgary Herald, University of Lethbridge to close and become a grain elevator. My mom phoned me and told me this, and I said, well, they haven't come for us yet, so it wasn't true. But there really was not much to come to. And why would some people do it, and what did they come to? Well, they came to some interesting things. They had a teaching load of 5 to 6 courses. When I hear my young colleagues complain about 3, I just say, grow up. And sometimes we had to teach out at college, Red Crow College or Medicine Hat, and so on, because we needed students. You may know the story that at one point before I came, Bill Beckles suggested that each faculty member enroll in a class, because that would increase the enrollment. And the concern was we couldn't do this because some might fail, and it wouldn't look good. Well, there weren't any real labs at the college, because that's where the university was. There were plans for a new building, but not for real research labs. And I say here, in the case of psychology, none. People didn't know psychologists did research. I remember, and this persisted for a long time, when Ani Kasich was dean and I was chair of psychology, he wanted me to give him a tour of our facility, so I showed him all around, and we get to the end, and he said, well, this is great, but where are the couches? I said, couches? We don't do that. Oh, and I think he was quite bewildered by that, and that was relatively recent. There were no graduate programs, and there was never going to be any. The last one's interesting. The faculty were all men. So the question here is not, is it because men hired men? Well, they did, but the reason there were no women was rather different. We had a hell of a time hiring women, and they just would turn us down. And so finally I phoned one of them and said, really disappointed you're not coming, but can you tell me why? And she said, well, it's a department full of men who are married, and a single woman is not going to fit in. Do you think I can go for a beer with you guys? Not going to happen. Their wives won't allow it. And she said, I won't be part of it. And so what we had to start looking for was married women. And that was a lot harder to find. And that's why there were no women. There are now. Okay, so how can you make a silk purse out of this? Not so easy. But Neal Holmes, who not related to Owen Holmes, that's right, isn't it, Charles? They're not related, no. Neal Holmes was the chair of the Board of Governors. He was a research scientist at one of the research stations, and he wanted to make sure there was a science presence. So we thought, what we'll do is we'll go out and we'll recruit some people. Now, this turned out not to be easy, but one person he knew of was Emil Wagner, who was an EM, electron microscope expert, and he called Emil and said, here's this opportunity. Emil had been doing work with him at the research station, so Emil came. and they got him an electron microscope. The next person who came had a different story, and you've heard about Loren already, Loren Hepler. He came for two reasons. One is that he and Owen Holmes, who was the Dean of Arts and Science, had been students together at Berkeley. When they left, Owen went to Saskatchewan, and Loren went to Virginia, and then to what's now Carnegie Mellon, and was basically teaching chemical engineering, and had a textbook that I wish he were still alive because I could lord it over on him. When we published our book, he took us into his office and said, "Look at that, 3 editions." Too bad, Loren. But why did he come? He phoned Owen and said, "I want to come and visit you." And Owen said, "There's nothing here for you, Loren." He said, "No, I'm coming." So it was the middle of winter. I got this from Owen. He came up to visit, and he said, "We're moving here." He's got 4 sons. He's a Quaker, and the Vietnam War is on. And he said, "I can't live there." And so he moved. Now, he also said, "I've got too many graduate students and too many postdocs, and it's a way of simplifying my life." And that's what he did. And I gather from Bob McKay, who's here, that in the first year or two, mostly he played racquetball, but got bored with that quickly and then started what he started. The next one has also an interesting story. This is Job Kuyt, who was a classical botanist. Job Kuyt was fired from UBC, and he was on leave at Berkeley. The reason he was fired at UBC was because he was married to the chair's daughter, and the people were out to get the chair. And so they did. They got the chair by firing his son-in-law. So Job had no job, and he was desperate. He had 3 boys. They needed a place to work, and he came here. Job is an amazing person. And one of the things I most liked was, going back to what Reg said, there's things here, right? You can study things here. He has this book, which is fabulous. There's probably only 20 copies published. It's be very expensive. And if you have a chance to look at it, it's just wonderful. Waterton Park is a unique place, and he showed that in that book. He also had a book on plants of the coulees, which he used to have a summer course. I've got the book. I should have scanned it. Anyway, he has lots of academic books, too. Job was unfortunate. He was fired because he got old, and which we used to do. And he went to the University of Victoria and still has a lab there. The next one is somebody that I met in a statistics class in 1965. I took an immediate dislike because he was rude. And I remember, big surprise. And he was rude in the following way. I was sitting beside him, and he put his hand up, and the professor's name was June Adam. And he says, "June," he said, "what's the point of all this? Why are we doing this?" And I looked at him and I thought, "You're calling this person June? I'm 18 years old, and they're gods." And she says, "Mr. Wishaw, when you grow up, you'll know why." And I was, anyway, we have a long history, as you can see. Now, the next one is rather unusual, and he came a year before Wishaw, and I've got him afterward. There's a reason. This is Don Reed, and I asked him for an old photograph, and this is the oldest he had, which he didn't look like that when I came. But he actually, when he came here from Kansas with his newly minted PhD, he opened up a head shop downtown and sold moccasins and beads and stuff like that. And when I first came here, he still had the store. But when I came, things started to change for a variety of reasons, and he ended up being the first cognitive scientist here and got an insert grant a couple of years after me and had a terrific career. He was in the first early retirement program and unfortunately left and went to Victoria and then went to become chair at SFU, and he's just retired from that. I guess that Don's probably 75. And then we have me, and I'll say more about that later. And we have Seamus, but in the early days we all called him Jim. I'm not sure why the name changed, although when I was trying to find a photograph of him, I discovered that there are hundreds of photographs of a soccer player named Seamus OShea, and I suspect he may have been living on some sort of dream there. So his addition to the chemistry department was really important because the chemists really were physical chemists, Lauren and Keith, and then we had Chris Bender being the Keith McCurdy, and then Chris Bender doing organic. But as you may know, Seamus did modeling. That was very different, and that was the future. So he changed things. Well, the 1980s were pretty special because we hired a bunch of pretty interesting people. René Barendrecht. I was trying to think of the first time I met these people. René may remember. He was walking down the hall, and I was walking towards his new department of geography, and I said, "Oh, you must be new. I'm Bryan Kolb." And he said, "You're one of the guys putting the place on the map. I just heard that." And I looked at him and I said, "Pardon?" He said, "Yeah, where were you a postdoc?" Yeah, UC Davis. He said, "You guys just published a book, right? And you've invented a new field." And I looked at him and I said, "Yeah, okay." And he knew that. I was quite surprised. Gail Michener. The first time I met Gail was interesting as well because I gave a talk in biology called What's the Difference Between Research Done by Psychology and Biology? And the point I was trying to make was that the research in psychology was interested in mechanisms that control behavior, and in biology more or less in evolution. And so I gave my talk, and she gets up, and I didn't know who she was, and she said, "Well, that's all very interesting, but I know the difference between psychologists and biologists. Biologists love their animals, and you guys are mean to yours." And I said, "This is coming from someone who has a stuffed pheasant by the coffee pot?" And Job Kite thought that was just hilarious. So I can't remember the first time I met David or Stuart. I was chatting with Stuart. Rob Sutherland was my postdoc, and he came in 1980. And I knew that if you're going to hire people, make sure they're smarter than you. And that was an excellent hire. I'll say no more on that right now. Okay. Then we had the NSERC University Research Fellow Program. So once again, the current crop of trainees moan and complain about how easy it was to get a job in our day and how hard it is now. And I've got in my desk a big folder of PFO letters. There's about 80 of them. And I bring them out and say, "Here, see how easy it was. This university didn't hire me twice." And so the URF program was designed to try and bring young scholars who had no job and try and hold on to them and keep them in the system. And the University of Lethbridge did really well. So we had Gail and Stuart in biology, a guy called Jan Spitzer in chemistry, Godfrey Gums in physics, and I'm going to say something about him in a second, and then 3 in psychology. Let's go back to Godfrey Gums. I've got a story for Erasmus. So Godfrey Gums, most of you won't remember, but there's 2 important things about him. Many, but 2 is that one, he was an outstanding physicist, and the other is that he's black. And so he had gone to some big conference in Europe, and he came storming down the hall and wanted to talk to me. It was really important. And I said, "What?" And he said, "Well, I met a really close friend of yours and had to sit beside him on the plane from Europe, and I want to know if what he says is true." And I looked at him and I said, "Who is it?" And he said, "Philippe Rushton." Philippe Rushton is a racist. He's dead. Is a racist who was writing books on the difference in the IQ between blacks and whites. And I looked at Godfrey and I said, "It's just nonsense." And he said, "Thank God." And I said, "And by the way, he's not a friend of mine." And he said, "I didn't think so." So, some personal history. Okay, why did I come here? Well, I was unemployable. And the reason I was unemployable, there are 2 reasons. One is that the research I was doing, which I've done for the last 50 years, was considered passé, and you had to do fancier stuff. And the other thing is I was Canadian. And Canadians were not welcome in Canada. So they simply were not welcome. So everybody was American. And I'll get to this in spades at the U of A in a second. I went to the Montreal Neurological Institute. I knew nothing about the human brain, and I went and asked all the graduate students, "What do you read?" And they said, "There's nothing to read." And I said, "There's a library full of books." They said, "There's nothing to read." So I had an idea, well, then I'll make a reading list. So I went and asked everybody in the institute, what one paper should you read? They told me, and I thought, this is neat, made a course up. Took the course to the chair of psychology and said, here's a course, could we put it on? And he looked at it, he said, nobody would take this. It was called Human Neuropsychology. Nobody would take this. There's no such field. And I said, well, how many would we need? And he said, 8. I don't want to be paid, I just want the course, because that's how you learn, right? And so, meanwhile, I thought, I'm right. So I wrote, yet again, to every university in Canada saying, this is the future. This is the course that you need in your department. Same vita that I'd not got a job anywhere for the previous 3 years. And I had 8 job offers and interviews and job offers because of this course. I went to the University of Alberta and they pointed out I was the first Canadian they'd ever interviewed. Every single person in the department but one were Americans. So that's the climate we were in. And so when people say, as Reg did, the reason people go to the University of Lethbridge is because they weren't hired at the U of A, I turned them down to come here. Why? Well, I'll tell you, the part of the story is I had the interview with Tony Long, who was the dean. He had one piece of paper on his desk. He slid it across and he said, it's the job description, is that you? And I said, no. He said, we're agreed on one thing. He said, have you ever taken these courses you'll have to teach? And I said, no. And he said, but you can teach them. I said, yeah. If you're good, you can do it. I can do anything, sure. And he said, and this neuropsychology thing, is this really a course? And I said, well, I told you the story about the chair at psychology at McGill. When I decided I was leaving, I went to see him and I said, well, you forget about the course. And he says, what are you talking about? And I said, well, I'm leaving. And he said, you can't leave. 175 students signed up. And I went, they're interested in the human brain for a reason. So the model that we established in psychology and then psychology and neuroscience was not to try and hire people who could teach tiddlywinks, but rather, how will they make our research program better? And just tell them they're teaching this. And I have to say that I was only about 3 hours ahead of the students in a couple of the courses, but we made it through and it worked out. So I came here, and the night that I interviewed here, I was staying at Wishaw's. I didn't realize that meant staying on a couch that was probably made in 1850. And he got a case of Lethbridge Pilsner. Remember Lethbridge Pilsner? And he opened it up, this box, and he takes all the tops off the bottles. I said, why are you doing that? He said, well, when we're done, you'll be coming here. So we sat up a long time and decided why that was a bad idea. So there's more than just NSERC. So when I came, people had one grant. So I wrote an NSERC grant and I got it. But it wasn't enough money. It was $10,000. You can't do research on $10,000. So I went to Owen and said, can I apply for other grants? And he said, well, what? And I said, well, how about MRC? No, nobody would fund MRC here. We're not medical. And I went, well, I've got the brochures here, and I think I could do that. And he said, well, go ahead. So I wrote an MRC grant and got it. And then I thought, well, I do mental health. There's a new outfit called Alberta Mental Health. So I wrote a grant for them and got that too. And so it turns out there's a lot more granting agencies than NSERC. And once we showed that we could do it, the gates opened, and that's where all those numbers come from. Because money started coming in because we started applying for all these grants that we had no business doing. But there's more than just getting grants, and I can't emphasize this enough to deans and so on, and that is, when I was here, I complained bitterly about a couple of things, ended up on grant committees. Now, nobody from the University of Lethbridge had ever been on an NSERC committee before, and I think nobody from a small university had. Alberta Heritage had me on a grant committee as well early on, and because I complained. And it turns out that the things that were said in the room when I first showed up really weren't very nice about the University of Lethbridge. People would look at me, but they'd say it anyway, like it's just a crap old place in the middle of nowhere. Like, why would we give them money? And I said, well, I'm in a conflict of interest here, but I'll tell you why. And a lot of business gets done at as Andy Waniak knows, a lot of business gets done at the urinal, so there's only men. But at dinner, at coffee, and so on, chatting about people. And I think it's critical that people be on these committees, and we've done really well. We've got a lot of people going to Ottawa routinely. We never got course relief in the old days. And it was like taking a course just to review all these grants, but it was critical. And I think because we did it, it made a difference. Reflections of the early days. I got hammered in my first teaching evaluations because I was asking the smokers not to sit in the first couple of rows because it really bugged my contacts, which mercifully I don't have anymore. But and one of the people in the class later became mayor of Lethbridge, and he, Rako Dodic, complained bitterly that you got no right to tell us where to sit. I said, yes, I do. Well, people can't believe that there was smoking in class, and the labs, Sutherland used to have this big ashtray full of cigarette butts. We had cutting edge technology though. We had overheads, we had chalk, and we had Selectrics. This is how you worked, and you could have one if you really wanted it. Actually, I suspect it's just all faculty in arts and science, because Larry Hoy promised me one, and I actually talked him out of a second one that I could have in the lab that the students could use. So we had Selectrics. We, in 1984, got this fancy thing called a Mac, and it had an internal memory of 512 KB, which is a short paragraph, so you could go and it would crash. And so you had to have an external hard drive, and it was considered a portable computer. And I can remember walking up the tunnel, carrying the tunnel, you remember the tunnel, carrying this thing, not very portable. Well, we had no photocopiers. So there was a photocopier in the post office. We don't have a post office anymore. But so to get stuff photocopied, you gave it to the secretary who took it for the morning mail, left it there in the afternoon mail, and brought it back. That's how we got stuff photocopied. And it cost you dearly if you did very much. We had no infrastructure help of any kind, as Reg already mentioned. We had no automation of anything. So we analyzed EEG tracings. Today, people have very fancy computer programs and they can just push a button and it's all done. But we didn't. We had metric computers that looked like that. So I can recall OShea and I sitting there for hours counting one. And he'd say something and I'd say, you realize you just screwed me up. So we'd count and do the statistics on stuff we counted. So why did neuroscience end up here? And I'm going to use the Shakespearean term. It was a conspiracy of circumstances that happened. Now I can say we had a rocky start, and I had the privilege of sitting beside Peter Lougheed at a dinner, obviously before he died, 6 or 8 years ago. And it was really interesting because we were assigned seating, so I went over and said, oh, Mr. Lougheed, I'm Bryan Kolb. I started to tell him who I was. He said, I know who you are. Oh, that's because you knew my father. It's got nothing to do with your father. And I said, oh, as I sat down, he said, you know, we were going to close the University of Lethbridge. I said, yeah, I read about the grain elevator. And he said, well, that wasn't going to happen. He said, but there were a couple of guys down there in psychology who looked like they were turning the place around. We thought we'd give you a chance. Here we are. So we had a rocky start. And I've said good things about Job Kuyt. I'm not saying anything mean, except he said this at a Faculty of Arts and Science meeting. Psychology is a cancer on the university. Well, that's because we were expanding, as Larry Hoare will recall, and trying to get space, trying to get things, and he didn't approve of it. But not only that, Chris Bender didn't really think we were scientists. And he was showing somebody around, a visitor, and he came walking in. I was doing surgery. It was all open, right? And he came walking in, and he looks at me, and he looks around, and he says to this guy, these guys are almost scientists. And then they left. And I thought, okay. So the history of neuroscience. We started out as a department of psychology with no labs of any sort in the new building. We hired me, and then we hired OShea first, and then we hired me, and then we hired Rob Sutherland. So now there's 3 of us. How did Rob Sutherland get hired? He was hired into the nursing program to teach human physiology. So once again, we're looking to hire people to make a research group. This is how you do it. To get a research group, not to teach specific courses. What did he know about human physiology? Nothing. So he ended up teaching a course in human sexuality, which became very popular and so on. But just said, this is what you're doing. The first year, you're just making up courses and do it. Because neuroscience kept expanding, we decided to change the name of the department to Psychology and Neuroscience, and actually were able to offer a degree, BSc in Neuroscience, as well as a BA or a BSc or BASc in Psychology. But we needed more space, and one thing that happened was I had received a Killam Award, and Howard was so excited, Howard Tennant was so excited that I got this, because it was the first one here, that he said, well, make it a 3-year award so we can hire someone to replace you. And so we hired Jeff Klein. And Jeff Klein no sooner came, and we said, you should apply for Heritage. No Heritage Foundation scholars had ever been here, so he applied for Heritage, and he got it. Well, we haven't got any space. So Ian and I went to see Howard and said, Howard, we need more space, and the space that was Emil Wagner's lab isn't being used. And we needed it coincident with ours. It just happened to be right next to us. And so we said, how about if we took over that? And he just said, I'm not going to use his exact words, but you can imagine it was not flattering to get the hell out of there. A little stronger than that, because tomorrow you just want something else. Yeah, I suppose. So we left, and then the next day he comes down the hall and he says, Kolb, where's OShea? And I said, he's in his office. Come with me. We go in. He says, all right, I apologize. I was a little harsh. We'll just build you a bloody building. And we looked at him and started laughing. And he said, I'm serious. They've just announced CFI. You guys have a company. You'll be our partner. And I went, hold it. The company doesn't make money. The company makes money for our research, and we buy equipment with the money we make. He said, that's good enough. And he sort of said, there's this money in that, and there's, like a shell game. And at the end, we'll be able to build you a building. And I said, are we going to jail? Because there's no way that we're going to be able to control. He says, leave it to me. It'll be all okay. So we have CCBN. Why is it called the Canadian Centre for Behavioral Neuroscience? Jim Horstman was the chancellor at the time. And so we went to Jim and said, we want to call it this. And he looked at me and he said, I don't know about that. But they do call it the Canadian National Exhibition. So, God damn them, it's CCBN. So that's how it got its name. Thank you, Jim Horstman. Then we ended up being 2 departments, and we were warned about this, and that is when you have one thing, and then you split them a mile apart, you have 2 things. And so we ended up, unfortunately, I think, to this day, having 2 departments. We then, when the building was built, a lot of it was shelled, because it was sort of like the Field of Dreams, build it and they'll come. Well, they did. And we had to finish it. And then we had to get an addition and another addition. And so we just kept, I can see Yob's point about cancer on the university, this thing was growing. And then Dennis Fitzpatrick had this idea that AFMR had just announced a Polaris Award, which is $20 million for 10 years. And so he said, we can do that for neuroscience because we know you guys can attract people to apply who in fact would get it. And we said, oh yeah. So we did. And neither Calgary or Edmonton actually ever got it together. And then the plug was pulled on AFMR, so we got our $20 million men and they didn't, which annoys them. And then we have the Kowalchuks bringing epigenetics, which made a huge difference to what the enterprise is. I'll come back to that in a second. So where are we now? We have a culture of science in the place that was not there when I came. I was called a rate buster by my colleagues. I didn't know what that was, that I learned. Something to do with too many papers, Reg. We have women faculty members. They're all married. We have reduced teaching. I haven't taught 6 courses for a while, I can tell you. We have real labs, and with the destination place coming, there'll be even better labs. We have graduate programs, which began, I think, about 1990 or something like that. I actually did an analysis to see whether graduate students helped your research, and the answer is no. I actually published just as much without them as with them, and one of the reasons is when I sat down and wrote a paper, it was done. When they write a paper, I've just begun. You know what I'm talking about. Most PIs in science have grants, and most in our department have multiple grants. And an important thing is that science has become a team sport. For people in social science and humanities, they often can't understand why you have so many authors. We have so many authors on papers because we've taken 5 papers and put them all together to make it better. So we've got people like the Kovalchuks doing epigenetics. I can't do it, but they can't do what I do. So you put it together and you get something better. So it really has become a team sport, and that requires that you have a culture that we all understand. Okay, where are we now? I think we have a national science presence, and it's partly through our role in all of these agencies that you can read there. We've really made ourselves known, and we've done it in a kind of quiet way, but it's worked. How did this happen? Well, I think we had careful and in many cases lucky hiring of faculty members, because you're hiring people, it's very difficult to guess how someone's going to do. You just simply could not know. And we have a supportive atmosphere among the scientists and some far-sighted administrators, which will include the same list that you had there, for sure. Owen in particular, I have to tell you a story to end here with Owen. So when my wife and I were driving from McGill to Lethbridge, our car broke down in Thunder Bay on July 1st weekend. There's not much going on there. At least there wasn't in 1976. But the end point was that I was 2 days late getting here. And so I no sooner arrived, and the secretary said, Dr. Holmes wants to see you. And I went, well, this is great. I'm 2 days late. He's going to fire me before I start. And so I went to see him, and he said, is everything okay? And I said, I'm really sorry about being late. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, I missed 2 days. You can dock my salary. He looked at me like I was from the moon. And he said, no. He said, I just wanted to give you one piece of advice. Don't cut your lawn on Wednesday afternoon. And I said, what? And he said, well, everybody knows professors don't work in the summer. And if you cut your lawn on Wednesday afternoon, you're just reinforcing that. So do it at night. And I said, okay, I got that. So I've never done that. We have some challenges. Departmental boundaries are blurring, especially in the sciences, but I could see it in the social sciences as well. If you look at biology and neuroscience, if you look at our department, it started out as psychology. There are 16 of us, I think, and only 5 are psychologists. We have 4 engineers and so on. So the boundaries are blurring. Neuroscience didn't exist 50 years ago. The cost of research is a real problem. I'm on a CIHR panel this year, and we're expecting to fund 8% of the grants. That's none. And I would guess that of the ones I read, 80% should be funded. It'll be 8. And we don't have succession plans. And you might look around and notice there's a lot of gray hairs. And I really think we need to decide how we're going to do this, or we won't be going so far in the next 50 years. We're going to have to try and figure out a way to make sure we can continue on this pathway. Thanks.